Hello and welcome to Real Cheating Story. I still couldn't believe that Robbie had left me without even saying a word. I was so angry and devastated that he could leave after 24 years of marriage without a single word. How could he do that to me? Everyone was telling me that I had to move on and get on with my life. I know they're right, but it is still so very hard for me to do. In an effort to try to move on, I decided to reorganize the basement. It had been Robbie's sanctuary when he just wanted to be by himself and play his guitar. I thought all his stuff was gone, but then I found a box in a corner next to a bookshelf. Aside from some high school memorabilia, there were about a dozen notebooks. Apparently, he had kept a series of journals over the years. I noticed a 3-ring binder where Robbie seemed to have collected bits from various journals into one place. The sight of Robbie's journal brought another wave of sadness, anger, and more tears for him abandoning me. Finally, when I regained control, I wiped the tears from my cheeks and took the binder upstairs to the living room. After settling on the couch with my heart still aching, I started to read Robbie Wilder's journal. I learned to play the guitar when I was 4 years old. My granddaddy Seth Wilder taught me and bought me my first guitar when I was 6. From that time on, it seemed like I had a guitar in my hands just about all the time. My granddaddy also taught me to love country music. He instilled in me an appreciation for many forms of music, though I must admit I still haven't found a rap song that resonates with me. To me, it just seems rough and crude. But I guess that's why they say different strokes for different folks. On the other hand, there's something about country music that really strikes a chord with me. I'm not saying I like all country music, but I find much more that I like than I don't. I especially enjoy the stars from the 50s through the 70s, artists like George Jones, Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, Loretta Lynn, Kenny Rogers, and especially Patsy Cline. I love just about everything those artists did. When I turned 12, my parents, Jason and Hannah, let my granddaddy take me on weekend tours of churches within a 50-mile radius. Granddad was part of a trio that performed gospel songs at various churches once a month. The group would perform at 2 or 3 churches over a weekend, and they were well loved. Attendance at those churches always increased when people knew Granddad and his group would be there. I remember my dad's last words to me before we hit the road the first time. He knew how nervous I was. "Robbie, just let the music flow from your soul, and you'll do fine." Every day since then, whenever I play and sing, I've tried to let people feel how much the music means to me. I can play guitar with the best of them, but I believe my voice is only mediocre. My granddaddy never agreed with my assessment, but he always thought everything I did was great. Still, I can project power into my songs that most singers can't, and over the years, I've developed an ability to instantly connect with an audience. On that first trip, I was beyond nervous when we reached the first church. It was an oversized chapel that could seat maybe 40 people, but there were perhaps another 200 folding chairs set up under the trees around the front and sides of the church. The speakers were hung from the church's sides and a couple of trees. My stomach felt like jelly as I followed my granddad up to the altar. My granddaddy played acoustic guitar, Bert Zimmer played bass guitar, and Willie Stanton played the banjo or fiddle. I usually played acoustic guitar but could also play bass guitar or banjo. I wasn't quite as good as Bert or Willie, but I was close, and within 2 years, I would surpass them. The church was beautiful, with pews that had hand carvings on each end and stained glass windows all around. The altar was made from mahogany with an elaborate cross carved into the center and angels at each corner. The huge crucifix hanging behind the altar was hand-carved, and the expression carved into Christ's face made you almost feel his pain. The pastor began the service, and it was an abbreviated one. We performed 2 hymns to complement his service, with me on the banjo. After we got into the first song, I began to relax. All I had to do was play my instrument, but after the church service was completed, we began the real performance. I knew that I had to sing a duet with my granddad, Just a Closer Walk with Thee. As we got closer to that number, I started to get really nervous again. But my granddaddy was so smooth with the church members that I believed they would have clapped if I screeched like a chicken hawk. Anyway, the numbers leading up to my duet went well, and the church members were quite appreciative. When I got up to sing the duet, I was still very nervous, but a smile from my granddaddy calmed me right down. When we finished, the congregation cheered us. That was the first time outside of my family that anyone had applauded my music. It was a thrill like I had never felt before. I was hooked. The pastor was extremely pleased. He said that this was the largest attendance his church had ever had, and the donations made that day would help pull them out of the red. The only money my granddaddy's group would ever take was a few dollars for gas and food. If the church women hadn't prepared something before we left, the pastor wanted to get a date for when my granddad and his group would be back. It was decided that we'd return in 2 months. My granddad liked to give every church that wanted his group an equal chance. The next church was an hour away, and it was one of those mega churches, the ones that have thousands of members. They actually had their own band that performed most Sundays, but today the band members were just going to be spectators. The church seemed more like an auditorium set up for a rock concert. The entire hall was set up to maximize the acoustics. Even the crucifix made of metal was angled to minimize any interference with the sounds coming from the altar. The windows, while stained glass, looked more like modern art. As nervous as I had been at the first performance, I was terrified at this one. There would be several thousand in attendance, including the standing room only people. The other church had been small and intimate, while this church was just so huge and intimidating. The sound system was amazing. It would put many recording studios to shame. What made this performance even more intimidating was that I had to do a solo of Amazing Grace. I was sure I was going to mess up big time. This worry had set my stomach to churning, and it didn't help that when we stopped for lunch, I had crammed down a double cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate shake. It wasn't sitting well on my stomach now, and I was having terrible gas pains but didn't know what to do. Still, I knew regardless, I had to go on with grit and determination. I clamped down hard on my butt cheeks and tried to soldier through. I was given a small stool to sit on with a mic set right before me. The group had just begun its first song when I couldn't hold the gas in any longer. I let out this ear-splitting fart, and because of where the mic was positioned, it amplified my gastric blast. The group stopped playing and looked over at me. A hush fell over the church while my face turned 16 different shades of red. I did the only thing I could think to do. I leaned close to the microphone and said, "The devil made me do it." A roar erupted from the congregation, and I could see my granddaddy and his buddies cracking up. When things began to settle down, my granddad looked over at me and said, "Don't you have something else you should say?" With a grin, I leaned into the mic again and added, "With God's grace and forgiveness, I won't do it again." Another roar erupted from the congregation. My granddad just chuckled and began to play again. I was never nervous in front of a crowd after that. Before I knew it, it was time for my solo. Even with what I thought was an average voice, I intended to power into this song, so I put every ounce of energy I could into my rendition of Amazing Grace. As the last notes were fading away, the congregation was on its feet cheering. The rest of the concert was a huge success. On the way home, there was considerable teasing about my gastric misadventure, but after dropping off Bird and Willie, my granddad turned serious. "Robbie, you had a great day today," he said with pride. "However, I hope you won't let it go to your head. I pray you never get the bug to become a famous singer. I've seen thousands of people chase that dream, and many of them are way better than you, but almost all of them wind up being bitterly disappointed. Millions of people every year chase that same dream, and only a handful ever realized success. Just love the music for its own beauty, and you won't ever be disappointed." Between my daddy and my granddaddy, the basis of my philosophy toward music and performing had taken root. I loved to play even if there was no one around, but I felt doubly blessed if there was someone to share my music with. I continued to perform with my granddad for 3 more years. However, the group then began to fall apart. First Bird had a stroke and couldn't play anymore, and then Willie passed away from a sudden heart attack. Finally, it was just my granddad and me, but after a few more months, it ended. My granddad's heart wasn't in it anymore. Besides, I was in high school and had discovered girls. Actually, I had discovered girls much earlier than this, but I never understood the workings of the female mind, and I don't think any guy ever will. Perhaps it was just my poor choices, but every time I tried to form a relationship with a girl or a woman, I'd end up getting hurt. When I was in the 3rd grade, I took a liking to Rebecca Simons. She was a tiny, blonde-haired girl that I thought was the prettiest thing ever. We became friendly, and then she said if I gave her my special rock, she would be my girlfriend. In reality, it was just a crystal that my mother had bought me. Still, when the sun shone through it at a certain angle, it displayed a rainbow of colors. However, 3 days later, Rebecca gave my rock to Jimmy Wheeler to be her boyfriend. When I challenged Rebecca about my special rock, she just laughed at me. I never did get it back. In the 7th grade, Annie Adams convinced me that she would show me hers if I showed her mine. Being naturally curious, I readily agreed. Unfortunately, we got caught. All hell broke loose, especially when Annie claimed it was all my idea. Back then, as it is today, they believed the girl. I got the thrashing of my life, but I took consolation in the fact that I had seen Annie. Still, I didn't understand why Annie had turned on me. When I asked her about it, she just smirked. As the years progressed, I became suspicious of girls, so I only had a dozen or so dates well into my junior year. I wasn't a bad-looking guy, but I was no hunk. Then I met Sally Bertrand. She was only a sophomore but really cute. I had 3 dates with her before I asked her to the junior prom. She was thrilled, and so was I. I ordered a tux and bought the tickets. 2 days before the prom, Sally told me her parents were making her go with Craig Wills. Craig was the captain of the basketball team and a junior who should have been a senior. There was no doubt in my mind she was trading up. I was crushed, but there was no way that I would let Sally know it. This was because of some advice my granddaddy had given me just before he decided to stop performing. He asked me if I had a girlfriend. When I told him no, he chuckled and said it was just as well. He explained that when I did decide to date girls, there was a good chance that one or more of them would break my heart. If that happened, he told me to never let the woman know it bothered me and never beg them to come back. Most importantly, he told me that if someone broke my heart, only time, distance, or another woman would mend it. So when Sally gave me the news, I told her it was no big deal. I just asked someone else. I knew from her expression she was insulted by my reaction. That alone gave me a small measure of satisfaction. I promptly went and asked one of Sally's friends if she'd like to go to the prom with me. In fact, I asked her best friend, Carol Adamson, who wasn't as pretty as Sally but still cute. She was thrilled. Really, it was a no-brainer for her. A sophomore girl being asked to the prom by an upperclassman was an instant status boost. The prom turned out to be pretty much a bore. I danced a lot with Carol, but she was really annoying. Just about every sentence out of her mouth ended with "you know." However, the evening was not a total loss. Craig managed to get drunk on whiskey that someone smuggled into the dance. I learned later that he threw up all over Sally while they were making out. Karma can certainly be a force. I went to community college for a year, but it wasn't for me. Even though I was a music major, I didn't think my professors really understood music. They were big on theory but had no soul, so I dropped out and got a job in a music store where I met and married Susie Carlucci. She was a hot-blooded Italian girl from a large family. She chased me until I fell hopelessly in love with her. Over the next 6 months, we dated, and I was thrilled when she agreed to marry me, even though her mother and father hated me. Her brothers thought I was cool and frequently came to the clubs where I performed. I loved working at the music store, but it certainly wasn't a high-paying job. Even combining my regular pay with what I made from teaching people to play different instruments, I only brought in about $30,000 a year. However, I averaged roughly $1,100 a week playing at various bars and cafes. Altogether, I was earning a little over $35,000 a year, which was more than a lot of people made in Tifton, Georgia. Susie and I were married for 3 years, and I thought everything was great. I loved her to death, and I thought she loved me. The sex was really good, but one day I came home and found Susie sitting in the living room of our rented house with a suitcase next to her. "What's going on?" I asked. "I'm sorry, Robbie, but I'm leaving you," she said as she looked at herself in a compact mirror. My granddad's advice immediately kicked in. Not that anyone gives a damn, but any particular reason? "Once we're divorced, I'm marrying George Menard," Susie said as she stared at me with disdain. "You have no ambition, and I want so much more than you can ever give me." Are you talking about the fat pig who owns the car dealerships? I said with a nasty smile. You've been seeing him? I hear he has a tiny wiener. Susie laughed at me. His is larger than yours, she said with a smirk, which caused me to snap. Thankfully, I didn't go completely out of control, but I did grab Susie by the hair and jerk her to her feet. She started screaming as I grabbed the back of her jeans and lifted her up. I carried her to the front door, kicked it open, and threw her onto the front lawn. Then I tossed her suitcase out beside her. Next, I called her parents and told them where they could pick up the trash. When Susie's father answered the phone, I snarled into it, Albert, your daughter has been seeing George Menard. I just threw her out onto the front lawn. Pick her up before the garbage men do. I made up the part about Menard getting her pregnant because I knew the Carlucci family were big Catholics, and that would be something they wouldn't take lightly. As it turned out, Susie was indeed pregnant, but the Carlucci family took her back. They never warmed up to George, though. It didn't matter, my heart was shattered, and I felt powerless. Having people wrong you and having to sit there and take it is the worst feeling in the world. I got a bit of revenge by calling Mrs. Menard to tell her what her husband and my wife were up to. Apparently, Susie had jumped the gun a little. Good old George was trying to hide a bunch of money before serving his wife with divorce papers. Forewarned, Mrs. Menard, with a horde of lawyers, descended on Mr. Menard. She didn't clean him out but got her pound of flesh. I learned about that from my lawyer during my own divorce, but it didn't soothe my feelings at all. I was devastated by Susie's betrayal, and my soul was crushed. Still, I didn't want anyone to know how much I was hurting, so I had to carry on. Okay, I admit I got drunk that night, but I went to my parents and sobered up the next day. I told them what Susie had done, minus the pregnancy part, which I still didn't know about at that time. Instead, I made it sound like Susie and I had become more like roommates. I don't know if they believed me, but they were very supportive. Susie had stabbed me in the back, and calling Mrs. Menard and Susie's parents was the only revenge I would get. What made it pure torture was seeing Susie riding around in her new BMW convertible, sometimes with George and sometimes by herself. Susie decided to have her payback for me throwing her on the front lawn. She would drag George to some of my performances and heckle me. I tried to ignore them at first, but eventually, I had had enough and went after them verbally. One night, I suppose I crossed the line when I asked Susie if she knew who the father of her unborn child was. That did get them to leave, but Susie still won in the end because I got fired. The bar's owner also refused to pay me for the night. Every day seemed to get worse, but I refused to let anyone know how much I was hurting. The Monday after I threw Susie out, I went back to work at the music store. Around noon, 3 of Susie's brothers showed up. I figured I was going to get the beatdown of my life when I saw them coming through the front door. I slipped some brass knuckles onto my right hand. They were probably going to kick the hell out of me, but I was ready to mess up 1 or 2 of them. Instead, they did nothing. Robbie, can we talk to you? Frankie, the oldest, asked as they walked in. I knew there was no place to run, so I nodded. Look, we just want you to know that there are no hard feelings from us, Frankie said, shuffling awkwardly in front of the cash register. I mean, I wish you hadn't thrown her out onto the front lawn, considering that she's pregnant, but we get it. You were justified. Well, screw me with a crooked stick, I said in total surprise. Now I felt bad about manhandling Susie, even though it wasn't my kid. I would have felt horrible if anything happened to the baby. I appreciate that, I said cautiously, but I didn't know Susie was pregnant. You told our dad she was pregnant? The youngest brother challenged. I know I accused her of it, but I really didn't know. I was just messing with your dad's head. The 3 brothers began to chuckle. Then Frankie spoke. I wish I had been there to see Susie land on her bum. That would have been priceless. Susie and Mom have been screaming at us to kick the hell out of you. Dad told them to shut their pie holes. He said you had every right to do what you did and more. Really? I was totally surprised that Susie's dad stood up for me. I thought he hated me. Oh, he still hates you, Frankie confirmed. It's just that he's an old-fashioned Italian man and he can't stand cheating wives. Susie's already caught his wrath a couple of times for talking back. I was relieved that Susie's brothers weren't angry with me. I truly liked them all, and I did my best to move on with my life in Tifton. But then my granddad began to fade. He had been put into a nursing home a month or two before Susie and I split. His mind was starting to falter, and that really saddened me. I visited him as often as possible and told him the whole story of Susie and me splitting up. On that particular day, he was more or less with it. "Robbie," he said with a sad smile, "you need time and you need to put some distance between you and your ex-wife." We talked for about an hour before he got tired. Just before I left that night, he reminded me never to chase the dream of being famous. He died the next day. I struggled on for another 3 months, but with my granddad gone and the love of my life now living with another man, I knew it was time to move on. My parents didn't want me to go, but they understood why I had to. The idea of leaving Tifton was scary. I had never thought about moving anywhere else until Susie dumped me and my granddad died. The good thing about Tifton was that it was only about 3.5 hours up I-75 to Atlanta. Plus, I ended up with a little over $5,000 after the divorce, most of it money I had been secretly saving for a vacation to Europe with Susie. I was supposed to split it with her by law, but I figured, screw her. I said goodbye to my folks, gave the finger to George Menard's dealership, and hit the road. When I got to Atlanta, it only took me a day to get settled. All I could afford was a room in College Park. As it turned out, the room was in a house owned by a nice black family. The Monroes, Henry and Mabel Monroe, had been happily married for almost 35 years. Both were in their mid-50s. Tyrone and Tabor were their 2 sons, both living at home and paying rent. Henry and Mabel were hesitant about renting to me because I was white. In fact, Henry even came out and said he'd feel strange renting to a white man. "Oh Lord," I said, touching my face frantically. Henry laughed, and Mabel put her hand on his arm. "He'll be fine. Rent him the room." It was a little strange at first, but they treated me well. After the brutal betrayal by my wife, it was soothing to watch a loving family interact. Henry was a postman, and Mabel worked in a daycare center. Tyrone was a mechanic, and Tabor said he sold real estate. After a while, I figured out that Tabor was actually a low-level drug dealer. His parents didn't know that he sold small amounts of marijuana, crystal meth, and ecstasy. Strange as it may seem, I got along with Tabor the best. No, I didn't use drugs, I preferred beer. What I liked about Tabor was his friendly humor. He was really funny and kept everyone laughing. Years later, I was devastated to hear that he had been gunned down one night in a drug deal gone bad. I chose College Park because MARTA, the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, ran right through it. I could walk to the station and avoid the hassle of parking in downtown Atlanta, which was both nearly impossible and expensive. Once I was settled, I started looking for a job. I must have applied at 40 or more places. Initially, I hit all the music stores within a reasonable distance, but none were hiring. Then I started with the classifieds. After interviews, either they weren't interested in me or I wasn't interested in them. After 2 weeks of not finding a job, I was getting discouraged. One afternoon, after getting turned down for another job, I decided to stop at a bar just down the street for a drink and something to eat. The outside of this bar was deceptive. It was much larger inside than it appeared from the street. I expected a small room with a bar counter and a few chairs and tables, but once I walked through the double doors, the room expanded on both sides. The lighting was dim, so I couldn't see very well. A long bar ran along the right side with about a dozen patrons having an early afternoon drink. The main floor was crowded with maybe 80 or 90 tables. What caught my eye was a small stage at the far end of the room, with instruments resting against several stools. It looked like they had live entertainment, which piqued my interest. But first, I wanted to get something to eat and a beer. I slid into a seat 3 down from the closest customer and waited for someone to notice me. From a used coaster on the bar, I learned that the place's name was Big Carl, and apparently, they did have live entertainment. Even though there weren't many patrons, 3 people were working behind the bar, 2 young men and a very attractive young woman. One of the guys appeared to be about 6 feet tall with brown hair. He had a very effeminate way about him, but he smiled a lot and seemed pleasant enough. The other guy seemed to be a couple of inches shorter with jet black hair and talked a blue streak to his partner. The girl was even prettier when I got a better look. She had dark auburn hair cut in a pageboy style, a button nose, and a slender but cute figure. If she had pointed ears, I might have thought she was an elf, and right now, she looked like an angry one. Eventually, the girl came up and tossed a new coaster on the bar in front of me. "What would you like? Can I get something to eat?" I asked. She snorted and then sighed. "Yeah, I guess so. What do you want? Could I get a hamburger and some French fries? I'd also like a bottle of Coors if you have it. If not, I'll take any domestic beer." "The hamburger will take at least 20 minutes, she snapped. "They're just getting the grills going. Why don't you order a sandwich?" The bit about the sandwich was spat out more like a command than a question. I hadn't had a particularly good day, and her attitude irked me. I didn't have to be anywhere, so I thought, screw it. I wanted a hamburger. "I can wait." "I want a hamburger," I said with a smile. After she placed my bottle of beer in front of me, none too gently, she turned on her heel and stormed away. I couldn't help but wonder who'd upset her this morning. I continued to watch as she dropped my order off, headed to the back, and up a set of stairs I hadn't noticed when I came in. The other two guys had disappeared into the kitchen. I didn't know if they had something to do in there or if they were just trying to stay out of the way of the angry elf. Having performed in a few bars, I was taken aback by her attitude. She seemed more than agitated, she seemed furious. I had no clue what was bothering her, but I sure wasn't going to put up with it if she gave me any more of her attitude. I sipped my beer for a few minutes while waiting for my food and finally got bored, so I got up and wandered around. I estimated that this place could easily hold a couple of hundred people with the tables and chairs in place. I noticed a sign that said the occupancy was limited to 275. Stopping in front of the stage, I saw it was a 20 by 20 raised platform with a bass guitar, a banjo, a synthesizer, and a kazoo. The synthesizer wasn't a top-of-the-line model, but it still must have cost at least $1,800. It seemed strange that they didn't have an acoustic guitar. I would learn the reason for that in just a couple of minutes. "Damn it, Carl. Ty just up and quit." I heard the girl with the auburn hair yell. I looked up to see a short, heavy-set man descending the stairs with the girl hot on his heels. The man, whom I guessed was Carl, appeared to be in his 50s or 60s. He had thin white hair, a pot belly, and a bulbous nose. The elf-like woman looked like she was ready to explode. "That's not my problem, Tanya," Carl said with a matter-of-fact voice. "If you can't replace him in the next hour, I'll get another group. Besides, you guys aren't setting the world on fire. Still, even if you can't get a replacement, I'll let you stay and work the bar until the new group gets the hang of it." "Screw you," Tanya said and stormed off into the kitchen. Then I heard yelling, and all three of them came out arguing. The gist of the argument was about replacing Ty with somebody who played acoustic guitar. Since I can play any kind of guitar, I thought this might be a golden opportunity. "Excuse me," I interrupted their argument. "But I couldn't help overhearing that you need an acoustic guitarist." "What about it?" Tanya snapped. "I can play any kind of guitar," I said with a smile. Tanya just frowned at me and turned back to her companions. "We've got to find someone established or we're out on our butts." The taller of the men looked at Tanya and then back to me. "Can you really play any guitar?" "Yeah," I responded enthusiastically. "What about songs?" "We're basically a cover group, leaning more toward the 60s and 70s, pop and country. Do you know any Beatles, Johnny Mathis, Dolly Parton, John Denver, Patsy Cline, or Glenn Campbell songs?" "Yeah, I know pretty much all of their songs," I said, kind of lying. I knew all Beatles, John Denver, Dolly Parton, and Patsy Cline songs. I used many of them when I performed in Tifton. However, I was a little shaky on Johnny Mathis and only knew one Glenn Campbell song, Rhinestone Cowboy. He wasn't one of my favorites, but when it came to Patsy Cline, I knew all of her big hits. Patsy Cline was my all-time favorite country singer. I usually ended my shows with one of her lesser-known hits, True Love. I don't know why, but singing that Patsy Cline song always seemed to get me a standing ovation. As for knowing the songs, I figured whatever I didn't know, I could learn quickly. Simon, we're wasting time, Tanya complained. We need to call a talent agency and see if they can get us someone for tonight. What's it going to take? 5-10 minutes to find out if this guy can do what he says, the guy argued, then turned to the other male. What do you think, George? Yeah, why not? George nodded. And if you don't want to listen, Tanya, you can go see if an agency has someone for us. Fine, Tanya stalked away, and I saw her pull out her cell phone and start searching the web. This was hopefully turning out to be a better day than I'd thought when I first walked into this bar. I headed for the stage, but George grabbed my arm. Wait a second. My bass guitar and Simon's banjo aren't going to work. There's an old guitar that Ty left because he bought a new one. It isn't very good, but we'll take that into consideration. George disappeared and returned a few minutes later with the promised guitar. It was pretty old and beat up, and it had dust on it, indicating it hadn't been played in a while. Still, beggars can't be choosers. I brushed the dust off and began tuning the guitar after taking a spot on the stage. Once I had Ty's old guitar tuned as much as it ever would be, I decided I'd only sing parts of 4 or 5 songs to give them a flavor of what I could do. I just hoped I would be good enough. I wanted this gig badly. I hadn't been able to perform for weeks, and I was beginning to burn through the $5,000 I had. When I was ready, I looked out at Simon and George and smiled. Hey, it's great to be here. I can't believe the size of this crowd. Settle back and let's get this show cranking. The two men cracked up, with George giving me a thumbs up. I then began with part of the only Glenn Campbell song I knew, Rhinestone Cowboy, then segued into Willie Nelson's On the Road Again, followed by Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, and finished with Patsy Cline's True Love. When I finished, the guys were clapping and whistling, and even the few people in the bar were clapping. It felt great, and I glanced over at Tanya. I knew that she would have the final say, and I said a silent prayer that she'd give me a chance. I stood by myself on the small stage, watching 3 people talk about me as though I wasn't there. I felt a bit like I was back in high school, waiting to get a test back that I wasn't sure I'd passed, except this time, I had just finished a mini audition for a small cover band that played in a bar called Big Carl's. I'd been in Atlanta for 2 weeks without finding a job, and my funds were dwindling. I didn't know what this particular job paid, but anything coming in would help stem my financial bleeding until I could find a real job. Although beautiful, Tanya, the group's leader, impressed me as being a total, well, let's just say I figured she'd tell me to take a hike. As I stepped down off the stage, I watched Tanya closely. She had put away her phone and was staring at me intently. I took the fact that she wasn't snarling as a good sign, but then she wasn't smiling either. Finally, Tanya joined George and Simon. Both guys were almost giddy with their smiles, but Tanya's face still revealed nothing. Finally, she smiled and stuck out her hand. I'm Tanya Parker, and the tall one here is Simon O.B. Backer, and the other is George Sanders. I put this group together, and we're known as Tanya and the Crew. And you are? I took her hand and replied, I'm Robbie Wilder. Well, Robbie Wilder, Tanya said after releasing my hand, do you have an acoustic guitar? Do bears in the woods? I laughed at the silly question. She smiled and then went serious. Here's the deal, we get paid $900 for singing 3 hours on Friday and 3 hours on Saturday nights. We also work behind the bar for the rest of the week. We put a tip jar out while we're singing. I get $300, and you guys split the rest. Any tips we get are split 4 ways. Your hourly pay for working the bar, which isn't much, is yours, as are any tips you get while serving drinks. Is this something that would interest you? Again with the bear's question. I was ecstatic. Tanya laughed and went back behind the bar. She returned 15 seconds later with several pages stapled together. It was a list of songs. The first 3 pages are the songs we do all the time. The other pages are songs that we drop in periodically. Check them out and let me know which ones you don't know. I scanned down the first page and a half and knew all of them. Then I found a Glenn Campbell song I wasn't familiar with and pointed to it. Tanya pulled out a copy of her own and marked that song. I finished off the complete list and found 5 more songs I didn't know. That's pretty impressive, Simon said. Ty was with us for a year, and there were 30 or 40 dozen songs that he either didn't bother to learn or couldn't play. How soon can you go get your guitar and get back here? Tanya asked as she looked at her watch. As long as it takes Marta to get me to College Park, pick up my guitar, and hustle back here. Good, Tanya said. I'd like to have a little warm-up practice before we go on. After they wrapped up my burger, I paid my bill and dashed out the door. Luck was with me when I hit the MARTA station, as a train had just come in. 20 minutes later, I hopped off and ran to the Monroe's house. I figured it was only a little before noon, so I had time for a quick shower and change of clothes. I walked on air back to the station with my guitar. $200 a week wouldn't be enough to cover all my expenses, but with tips and whatever I'd get paid for working behind the bar, I figured it would carry me until I found a full-time job. When I reached the platform, I had to wait about 10 minutes for the next train. All the while I was standing there, I bounced up and down, willing the train to come. I was back at the bar around 1:15. Tanya, George, and Simon were already playing when I walked in. I quickly got my guitar out and tuned it, then stepped up onto the stage and waited to be told what to do. I listened as the group played Glenn Campbell's Southern Nights, with Simon and Tanya singing it as a duet. It sounded good. Tanya had a beautiful voice, and Simon had a decent bass quality to his. I didn't really know the song but quickly picked up the melody. When they were about halfway through, I joined in. They all looked over and nodded when the song ended. Tanya went to get some water bottles, and when she returned, she tossed me a blue t-shirt with Tanya and the crew on the front. After handing out the water, Tanya started telling me what she expected. She decided which songs would be sung at each performance and in what order. I glanced at her list and didn't find anything I couldn't handle. Then she wanted me to sing Patsy Cline's True Love with her. It's always a little tricky singing a duet with someone you don't know. You're never quite sure what your singing partner will do. Sometimes they come in late or early, hold a note longer than they should, or sing at a faster or slower tempo than the song is supposed to be sung. I found Tanya very easy to sing with. We matched and harmonized perfectly. Moments after we got into the song, I noticed the other employees and the few customers had turned to watch us. When we finished, even though the crowd was small, we received a rousing ovation. We're absolutely doing that song tonight, Tanya said as she thumbed through her sheets. We ran through the beginnings of about a dozen songs, and Tanya called an end to the practice. George then told me to follow him into the kitchen, where he gave me a bartender's apron. I have to be honest, I admitted with trepidation, I can play the guitar and sing, but I don't know anything about bartending. He laughed. It isn't rocket science. Tonight, we'll just have you serving beer in bottles and on draft. If there's time, I'll show you how to mix a few simple drinks. You'll pick it up pretty quickly. Just remember to be quick and smile, that will get you more tips. As more and more people began to drift into the bar at 5, I hopped back and forth, serving bottles of beer or pouring drafts. That night, I must have moved 30 cases of beer from the cooler out to the bar. I also learned how to install a new keg, slice dozens of all kinds of fruit, and mix a half-dozen drinks. I was pretty frazzled when 8 o'clock approached, and we headed to the stage. However, when I looked around, Tanya wasn't anywhere in sight. I just shrugged and retuned my guitar. About 5 minutes later, Tanya appeared to a round of applause. If my eyes weren't attached, they would have dropped to the floor. Tanya wasn't wearing the blue t-shirt. She had changed into a blue and green sundress, which was cut fairly low in the front. A good portion of her breasts was exposed, and the mystery of what remained certainly left many of the men in the audience drooling. As I looked out, only about half of the bar was full, but the patrons that were there were already pretty well lubricated. I had learned that this could be good or bad. A crowd that was very relaxed with alcohol was easier to entertain and tended to buy more drinks. However, there's a fine line between a relaxed customer and an obnoxious drunk. Still, I was super excited to get the night going. Tanya kicked off the night singing Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, which got the crowd into it right away. Then we moved to a Johnny Cash song, followed by Willie Nelson's On the Road Again, with all of us joining in. After about an hour and a half, Tanya told the crowd we were taking a 15-minute break and would be back. Sitting in the kitchen, sucking down a bottle of water, I felt more at peace than at any time since my divorce. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of pain in my heart. I hoped they wouldn't kick me out of the group after tonight. The crowd had been great so far, and Tanya was certainly the focus of all the males in the bar. She also had the attention of a goodly number of women. But as soon as we started the second half of our show, I knew something was off. There was a table of 2 women and 3 men close to the stage, and I knew instantly that they weren't feeling any pain. They were also getting kind of boisterous and rude, crossing the line from relaxed to obnoxious. Tanya was into her second song when one of the men made a crude remark about Tanya's hips. His comment wasn't wrong, Tanya had spectacular hips, but the comment was totally out of line, and I could see Tanya was getting angry. So I decided to step in. I had handled drunks many times before. They aren't bad people, they've just lost their inhibitions. The best way to deal with them is with humor and a little embarrassment. So when Tanya finished her song, I grabbed the mic from her. Thank you, I said as the lights began to dim. Tanya looked at me with annoyance but didn't say anything. We absolutely love it when people in the audience enjoy our shows, and this table over here seems to be enjoying the show more than anyone else. We like to show our appreciation for what you might call our super fans. I turned to the audience. Would you like to meet one of our super fans tonight? The crowd started clapping and calling out, yes, yes, yes. I smiled and pointed to the rowdy gentleman. You, sir, seem to be having the best time of anyone. Stand up and let everyone see you. The drunk jumped to his feet, swayed a little, and said, screw you. I'm sorry, I don't swing that way, I said with a smile. Not that there's anything wrong if that's your preference. The crowd roared with laughter and whistled. What's your name, sir? I quickly asked. Frank, he roared back. And I still say screw you. Frank continued. I don't know how much dating you do, Frank, but that approach isn't going to win any woman's heart, I said. The crowd howled and laughed. Now, Frank, I said innocently, I can call you Frank, can I? Hell yeah, boy. You have a one-track mind, I said, laughing with the crowd. Now, Frank, you seem to have a strong opinion about one particular part of my friend's anatomy. I think it's only fair that your own anatomy be judged. What do you think, folks? On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate Frank's butt? A roar of laughter followed by numbers being called out, 4, 2, 10. I let the number calling go on for about 10 seconds before announcing, it seems you have fallen very short in that part of your anatomy. I hope there's nothing else that falls short on your body. I looked at the ladies sitting at the table who had been laughing as hard as anyone else. Ladies, you know Frank. Does he have any other deficiencies? The 2 women nodded and cracked up. One of them held up her thumb and forefinger about an inch apart, which brought the house down. Frank turned scarlet and stormed out, jarring 2 tables as he went. When he was finally out the front door, the room got very quiet. I looked around and spread my hands in mock confusion. Was it something I said? The room went wild, and I got a standing ovation. As I handed the mic back to Tanya, she reached over and kissed me on the cheek. My hero, she said into the mic. This brought another roar from the crowd. The rest of the show went very well, especially when Tanya and I sang Patsy Cline's True Love at the end. We got a standing ovation. I was nervous as we started off the stage. I knew the show had gone well, but I didn't know what to expect. I had overstepped my bounds by taking the mic, but it just seemed to be the thing to do at the time. George was the first to speak. That was our best show ever. Simon followed immediately. Robbie, you had the meeting out of your hand. Outstanding job. I turned to Tanya, knowing she had the final say. She just walked up to me and gave me a big hug. I guess I was in. We weren't expected to tend bar after our performance, but we wound up helping the regulars and with the cleanup. During this time, I learned that Simon was gay and lived with his boyfriend Dave. I was relieved that he wasn't offended by my comments directed at the drunk. In fact, he thought it was really funny to watch the guy squirm. George was single and a real womanizer. He had a girl waiting for him to finish. If George hadn't made her show us her driver's license, I would have sworn she was no older than 15. I was shocked to learn she was 23. Lucky George. T was very closed off. All I got from her was that she had attended Juilliard in New York for a year. Tanya didn't say much about why she decided to leave school, only that her father had deserted them and her mother was dead. I also learned that Tanya was single and rarely dated. I didn't care, I was just thrilled to be able to perform and get paid for it. We had another show the following night, and it seemed like the crowd was slightly bigger, but I couldn't be sure. After my first show, Carl had taken me aside and told me he was impressed with how I handled the drunk. I thought we had another great show the second night, and Tanya and I sang 3 songs together. However, Carl pulled me aside again after that show and gave me some advice, or maybe it was a warning. "Kid, you've got talent," he said, patting me on the shoulder, "but in this business, don't trust anyone. Not Simon, not George, not Tanya, and for sure, don't trust me." As the weeks went by, I felt we were beginning to click on stage, but off stage, while George and Simon were very friendly, Tanya remained a very cold and distant ice princess. That didn't bother me at all as long as I could perform. To me, playing my guitar and singing fed my soul, and getting paid was just a huge bonus. The routine for the next 6 weeks was the same, working the bar and playing music each weekend while I continued to look for a job during the week. However, I have to admit that I wasn't looking too hard. I was covering my expenses with the money from performing, tips, and the minuscule pay for working the bar. With each passing week, Sue was becoming a distant memory, and the pain was fading. By my estimation, the crowds were getting bigger, but again, I had no way to measure it. Even if it was true, Carl decided to make a change. On that Monday, he told us that the upcoming weekend would be our last. He was bringing in a Beatles cover band for a 6-week deal. I was devastated. That meant I'd have to start looking for a job in earnest again. Carl had proved his advice to be spot on. I thought he liked our act and appreciated it, but the truth was he didn't care about us anyway. Once Carl lowered the boom on us, I went out and bought a newspaper. I was scanning the classifieds when Tanya stuck her head over my shoulder. "What are you doing?" she asked with a smile. "As much as I regret my decision not to do it," I said, grinning back, "I never trained myself to only eat once a week. I have to get a job. In fact, all of us need to find gainful employment." "Already taken care of," Tanya said as she grinned and walked away. "What?" I said, spinning on my stool. "Did you find a job already?" "No," she said with a coy smile. "We all found a job." "No way." "Where? What kind of job?" I responded in total confusion. "George, Simon." Tanya yelled into the kitchen. "Come out here, we have to talk about something." Once Tanya had us all together, she led us to a table on the far side of the bar. George and Simon were as confused as I was, but they didn't say anything until everyone was seated. "Okay, Tanya," George finally asked. "What do we need to discuss?" "I've got our next bookings lined up," Tanya said calmly. "Really?" George and Simon said at the same time. "Yep. At the Abbey Tree Lounge in Alpharetta for 4 weeks, and then at the Uptown Club in Cummings for 5 weeks. After that, we're going to Charlotte, North Carolina. Brad Brooks and Honey Weston are doing 2 shows at the Spectrum Center. Their opening act canceled on them, so we're filling in." "What's the pay?" Simon asked. "At the Abbey Tree, we're getting $2,000 a week, but we have to perform 6 nights and do a bar shift like we do here. At the Uptown, they're going to pay us $2,200 with the same deal as the Abbey. For the 2 concerts in Charlotte, we're getting $4,000 for the 2 nights. The Spectrum is a big venue," Simon said in awe. "That place holds at least 20,000 people. How did you arrange all of this?" "Actually, I've been working on it for a couple of months," Tanya responded with a Cheshire Cat look. "An agent caught our show and liked it. He contacted me when the Spectrum job came available, but I figured if we do well in Charlotte, we could be on our way." We all looked at each other with huge smiles. Then Tanya chuckled. "I was going to tell Carl on Sunday, but he beat me to the punch. I didn't say anything to him because I figured if he thought we were down and out, he might slip us a little something else." "Carl?" George snickered. "He'd steal his grandmother's eye teeth if he thought he could make a $1 off of them." "Before we get all excited," Simon said, raising his hands, how are we going to get to Alpharetta and Cummings? Marta doesn't go there, and even if we get to Charlotte, where are we going to stay? Rooms for 2 nights could eat up a big chunk of what we earn. Tanya looked at me questioningly. Robbie, you said you had a car. What do you say? I shrugged my shoulders. Actually, it's an SUV, but yeah, I can drive us if you guys will chip in some money for gas. But Simon's right about Charlotte. If it was just me, I'd sleep in my car, but with the 4 of us, that wouldn't work. That's already taken care of, Tanya said quickly. They've arranged a room for us for 1 night. I figured we'd travel up the day of the show, perform, and spend the night. After the second show, we'll head back. The only downside is that it's only 1 room, and just so it's clear with you 3, I get one of the beds. If it's just a king or queen size, you all are sleeping on the floor. If there are twin beds, you guys can fight over the other one. Both the Alpharetta and Cummings engagements went well. The customers at both establishments were generous, and we made almost $1,000 each week in tips. In Cummings, after we sang True Love at the end of the show, a guy came up and said he'd pay us $100 if we did it again, so we did. The spectrum was mind-blowing. None of us had ever performed before an audience that large. It was a little unnerving for George and Simon, but Tanya wasn't intimidated at all. As for me, if you can survive farting in front of thousands of people, very little phases you after that. Fortunately, we all pulled it together, and by the end of our set both nights, we had the crowd out of their seats, ready for the night's main entertainment. As we took our final bows the second night, I looked over at Tanya. Her eyes were shining. It seemed to me that Tanya was chasing the dream. After the Spectrum appearance, we all thought we were really on the move up. However, the opposite happened. Things really tapered off. We'd work a week or 2 and then have nothing for 2 or 3 weeks. It got downright grim, and I was tempted to look for a regular job. But I didn't want to give up performing, and I didn't want to leave Tanya in the lurch. Right after the new year, George and Simon told Tanya that they couldn't do it anymore. Simon took a job as a waiter, and George took a job as a carpenter on a construction site. All that time, I worked with George and never knew he was a carpenter. Tanya was about as down as one person could be. I have to admit that I wasn't feeling like any ray of sunshine either. I was a little better off than Tanya because I still had some of my bankroll from Tiffin. Even with that, my funds were beginning to dwindle at an alarming rate. I was about to throw in the towel when Tanya called me one morning and told me to meet her at the Pancake House. She apparently had an idea to jumpstart our musical careers. I knew I should be looking for a job, but I just couldn't say no to Tanya. I guess I was a little in love with her even at that point, but I never said or did anything to let on. I didn't want to get burned again, and I didn't want to sour our musical relationship. The next day, I found Tanya sitting at a table, sipping a cup of coffee. I slid into the chair next to her and asked, "So, what's your new idea?" "He should be here in a few minutes," she responded, nodding to the front of the restaurant. "There he is now." Glancing toward the entrance, I saw a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard looking around. When he saw Tanya, he waved and headed in her direction. He seemed to be in his early 50s with a friendly smile. He wore a dark blue sports coat, gray slacks, and a white collared shirt. "Robbie, this is Alex Meisner," Tanya introduced us. "He's a musical agent. He caught our act and thinks he can help us." With very little small talk, Mr. Meisner began discussing what we faced. The music industry has changed dramatically with the advent of the internet. For the most part, people download the music they want. Gone are the days of cutting a record and trying to convince a radio station to play it. Anyone can download their music to the internet, so you have to create your own exposure, your own excitement, your own brand. "That sounds great," I said, "but how do we accomplish that?" "That's what I do for you," Alex said confidently. "The first thing we need to do is get you playing at as many different places as possible." "That's the problem," Tanya admitted. "We started to get some bookings and even appeared at the Spectrum in Charlotte, but then everything seemed to dry up after that." "I heard about your performance at the Spectrum," Alex explained. "That probably hurt you." "How could that be?" Tanya demanded. "Well, from what I hear, you guys did pretty well," Alex said. "As a result, A lot of the people booking acts figured you'd want too much money, so they crossed you guys off their list. So you're saying we were penalized for being good? I asked in disbelief. Alex nodded. I guess that's a fair assessment. So what do we do now? I asked, churning inside at the unfairness of the system. Again, that's where I come in, the agent said as he stirred his coffee. I can get you booked in a bunch of different places, but they'll only be for a night or two, and then you'll be on to a new location. Mr. Meisner then looked over at me. Tanya tells me that you write songs. Yeah, I do, I admitted. But so does she. I've got 3 shoeboxes full of them, but we've never used any of them in our shows. Do you have any that revolve around kids? Alex asked. It can be babies, toddlers, teenagers, anything to do with children. I'm sure I have some, I admitted. But some of the songs aren't that good. I have a couple as well, Tanya chimed in, but my songs are pretty rough too. Doesn't matter, Alex said. Try to polish up your songs as well as you can. We're going to record the best ones you have. Then I want both of you to go through and pick out the best 6 to 8 songs with the same theme made famous by other artists. I looked over at Tanya, and she appeared to be as befuddled as I was. Okay, we can do that, but what's the point? I have a friend who works for a magazine that caters to child rearing, Alex explained. He's always looking for new ideas to write about. I pitched him the idea of a singing group putting together an album about kids, and he liked it. Now, if he likes the music, he'll do the article about you too. Alex Meisner really knew his business, and I was getting excited. But the big question I had was, what does this guy want in return? It was Tanya who posed the question. It all sounds good, Alex, she said in her no-nonsense voice. What do you get out of all this? I assume you're not working for free. He chuckled. Tanya, no one in this business works for free. If you want my help, you'll have to sign a standard contract that makes me your exclusive agent. You can take it to any attorney you want, but you'll find it is pretty similar to most contracts out there. Let me hit you with some of the important highlights. First of all, I get 10% of what you earn. That's non-negotiable. But I don't get a penny unless I get you paying gigs. Second, the contract is for 5 years, with an option for 5 additional years. Also, I get the final say about the outfits you wear, the music you play, and the group's name. Sorry, but Tanya and the crew doesn't cut it. Your new name will be the Wind Dreamers. Tanya didn't like that at all and argued to keep the original name. Alex was adamant about the change, and in the end, Tanya acquiesced. Tanya then spent 20 minutes reading through the contract. She could have been a damn good lawyer with her smarts and attention to detail. When Tanya finished reviewing the contract, she had no objections but did pick up 2 spelling mistakes. We then both signed it. The next 6 months were like a blur. I found 6 songs in my box that weren't horrible. Alex especially liked 2 I had written, A Small Child's Love and Daddy's Little Helper. Tanya had 2 songs he liked as well, Pretty Little Girl and Mommy's Angel. The other 2 of mine definitely weren't memorable. I didn't care too much for my outfit. It had me in tight leather pants, a fluffy long-sleeved white shirt, and a leather vest. Tanya's outfit, on the other hand, was hot. She wore a short leather skirt and a blouse that was really cut low. One other change Alex made was the addition of a synthesizer in our act. With George and Simon gone, he wanted more than just my acoustic guitar. Alex hired several different guys to man the synthesizer. However, a young guy named John Tynan was the one who performed with us the most. We were playing every night and even a bunch of Moss. We played in every venue you could think of, from bars to college auditoriums to churches. The churches were fun for me because of my familiarity with gospel music. Tanya hated doing those performances because the men would leer at her and the women would stare daggers, and this was with a blouse that was cut much higher. I was on the go so much that Mrs. Monroe stopped me one morning as I was on my way to collapse into bed. "Robbie, I worry about you," she said with kind eyes radiating sympathy. "You're on the go all hours of the day and night. I don't think you're getting enough to eat, and I know you aren't getting enough sleep. Thanks for worrying about me, Mom," I teased her as I gave her a kiss on the cheek. "I'm doing good though." She swatted my arm. Go get some sleep, and I'll fix you something to eat when you get up. The article for the childcare magazine was a big hit, and Alex sent us into a studio to produce an album that used up most of my reserve. It was released to the internet the same day the article was published. We had incorporated the 4 songs I mentioned with 8 songs made famous by others. The way it was set up, people could buy our album or individual songs online. Our internet sales were just short of terrible, however, we did pretty well selling our CDs at each of our performances. We could buy the CDs for $5 each, sell them for $12, and sell between $25 and $50 a night. That was like $175 to $350 extra each night. During this time, Tanya and I grew closer, and we even began dating. I often felt that Tanya was out of my league, but my feelings for her were strong. She frequently told me that I was the only person she truly trusted and cared for. I had been the one to support her through her toughest moments. I remember the first time we shared an intimate moment. We had been getting to know each other for weeks, and while Tanya wanted to take things slowly, I respected her boundaries. Then one night, as we were sitting together, she leaned in and whispered, "I want to be with you." That simple statement sparked a connection between us. As we embraced, it felt as if everything around us faded away. The warmth of our feelings enveloped us, and I knew that this moment would change everything. After that night, my love for Tanya deepened, and I realized I wanted to commit to her completely. 2 months later, I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. It was Alex who floated the idea of filming our wedding and releasing it on DVD. I was very hesitant about doing that, but Tanya was all for it. She thought it would give our careers a big boost. Finally, I agreed, and it was decided that we'd do it during a performance we had scheduled for one of the larger churches in the Atlanta area. I don't know how Alex convinced the church people to go along with his idea, but they did. Still, I hoped that it would be a relatively quiet wedding mixed with music and love. I got 2 out of the 3. The wedding, from my perspective, was filled with glorious music and tons of love. Quiet, however, it was not. The local media had gotten wind of it, and being a slow news cycle, they descended on the church in droves. I didn't want to let the media inside, but Tanya and the church board overruled me. Still, the church board had laid down very strict guidelines that kept the media from being their usual boorish, arrogant selves. Tanya and I discussed our wedding vows in some detail. Finally, we decided to sing a song made famous by Peter, Paul, and Mary, "This Is Love." It was Tanya who first suggested the song. I loved the idea but was surprised that Tanya would pick it. The song has a very deep religious tone, and I knew that Tanya wasn't religious at all. However, the song is tailor-made for a wedding. It is probably used in tens of thousands of marriages each year. I especially felt that the final line said everything about our love. Whenever 2 or more of you are gathered in his name, there is love, there is love. We sang the song before the actual wedding ceremony, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church. I noticed that even some of the media people were misty-eyed. After reciting our vows, Tanya and I sang a song I had written for the occasion, "You Are My One and Only True Love." As our voices began to fade away, the congregation and our friends were on their feet with a roar. It took almost 5 minutes for them to quiet down. Then we began the performance we had been contracted for. We had tailored our song list to include more love songs, along with some of the more uplifting hits. One part of the performance was very special. I had invited the Monroes to the wedding and had them sitting in the same row as my parents. Mrs. Monroe loved Nat King Cole, especially his song "When I Fall in Love." I had arranged to do my version of the song for Mrs. Monroe. Thank God for the synthesizer because Nat had a full orchestra behind him when he recorded his version. Before I began, I let everyone know that this song was for my second mother. I must not have done too badly because I could see tears running down Mrs. Monroe's cheeks as she snuggled close to her husband. Even Mr. Monroe's eyes were misting. Yes, my mother was also crying. My father tried to pretend that he had something in his eye. He did. It was tears. During the reception, I cornered Mr. and Mrs. Monroe with their sons. I told them I had left presents for all of them in the garage. For Tabor and Tyron, I had gotten them the latest Apple phones. Years later, when I learned about Tabor's death, they told me he was clutching that phone as he died. For Henry, I had gotten him the best table saw I could find. He was always doing odd jobs around the house. Henry had told me he would get a table saw when he could afford it, and then he'd really be able to fix up the house for Mabel. I got her an expensive Bose CD player and the complete CD collection of Nat King Cole. She had about worn out her record collection playing them over and over again. After the reception, Tanya and I left on our honeymoon to Key West, Florida. It was the happiest week of my life up until then: sun, surf, and Tanya. During the honeymoon, we had chosen a location that had no television or internet access. As a result, we had no idea that our wedding DVD was selling like hotcakes. The two songs, There Is Love and You Are My One and Only True Love, were released as singles and were climbing the charts. There Is Love would make it to number 32 on the Billboard Hot 100, and You Are My One and Only True Love made it to number 19 on the Country Top 100. Now we were starting to make some money and never seemed to lack bookings. We were even invited to perform at the Grand Ole Opry. With this surge, Alex felt that Tanya should become the face of our group. I totally agreed. She was a lot more fun to look at than I was, so I willingly let Alex do his thing. For the next 4.5 years, we did well. Still, Tanya was not content. She felt that we should be doing a lot better. I always categorized musical talent into 3 levels. There were the A-list people and groups, including the cream of the crop, like Tim McGraw and Carrie Underwood, or groups like the Statler Brothers or the Charlie Daniels Band. They were the stars everyone knew and had most of the big hits. Then there was the B-list, with people or groups like Tanya and me, who had a few hits but weren't big stars. Finally, there was everyone else, the vast majority of entertainers who never managed to support themselves singing. Tanya and I had done amazingly well. I considered us in the lower half of the B group. Still, we were doing fairly well, frequently opening for some of the A-list acts. The fact that we had 2 minor hits was more than 99% of all performers ever achieve. We were making a mid-5-figure income each year. We weren't superstars, but we were known, had our own fan base, and had played at the Grand Ole Opry. Still, despite our good fortune, which was mostly due to Alex's planning and promotions, Tanya wanted to reach the very top. I loved Tanya's passion but knew we weren't good enough to crack the A-list. Even more worrisome to me was that Tanya had totally fallen into the trap my grandfather had warned me about years ago. I wondered how she would handle it when she finally realized that she would never be a superstar. Still, I trusted her and Alex to keep us moving forward, or I should say, moving upward. Everything changed, however, while I was away visiting my parents in Tifton. Tanya and I had planned to go together, but she had a cold and didn't want me to catch it, so I went by myself. I had planned to spend a week with my parents. That's when things changed, and the snake was allowed to slither into our garden. I met my wife when I joined her musical group, Tanya and the Crew. Back then, we were a cover band that sang mostly country and pop songs made famous by others. Our music careers were on the verge of crashing and burning when a musical agent, Alex Meisner, agreed to manage us. Slowly, he began to build up our act. After Tanya and I were married, we established a decent reputation. We weren't superstars by any means, but we were making a good living. Married life with Tanya, for me anyway, was great. She seemed to be happy, and our love life was good. Still, I knew Tanya wasn't satisfied with our careers. She was always after Alex to get us better venues, better studio musicians, better recording contracts, more television exposure. In short, Tanya was chasing the dream of being a superstar and was frustrated that we weren't making more progress. I had to admit that this worried me because occasionally Tanya would take her frustrations out on me. This always hurt because I was working harder than anyone to make her dream come true. At the time, I accepted that was just who Tanya was. Besides, the makeup was really great. I think things changed a little when Tanya wrote 2 new songs that went nowhere, and then I wrote a new song that had a fair amount of success. It made it up to 17 on the country charts. For some reason, Tanya was a bit snappish to anyone who mentioned the song's success. That surprised me because it was a solo written just for her, but that strange mood only lasted for a week or so, and then Tanya was back to normal. After returning from a short 4-city tour, I decided we needed a break. I talked Tanya into coming with me to Tifton to visit my parents. Not having parents of her own, Tanya was always a little uneasy around mine, so I was surprised and happy when she actually agreed to come with me to my hometown. Personally, I was keen to visit as I had only been able to spend an odd day with Mom and Dad every so often. Occasionally, they came up to Atlanta to visit for a few days, but we were usually very busy during the day, so we only got to see them in the evenings. I guess I was a little homesick because I hadn't spent any real time in Tifton with my parents and the rest of my family in years. None of us was getting any younger. When I told my parents about our plans, my mother insisted on throwing us a party to see my relatives. Most of them had only met Tanya at our wedding. It was supposed to be a small affair at my parents' house, but it quickly grew to several hundred people, necessitating my parents renting the community center. I was frustrated with my mother's ever-expanding party, but Tanya told me to let her have her fun. However, the day before we were supposed to go, Tanya came down with a bad cold. Instead of canceling, Tanya insisted that I go by myself. I checked Tanya's temperature before I left, and it was hovering around 101. After assuring me that she would be fine, I headed south. Of course, my parents were very disappointed that my wife couldn't make the trip, but they were thrilled to see me nonetheless. During the week, I visited with most of my relatives and caught up with a lot of my high school buddies. I called Tanya every night to check on her. By Thursday, she seemed to be getting better but sounded totally congested. The big party was set for that Saturday, and I wasn't particularly looking forward to it. Still, it was something my mother wanted, and I wanted her to be happy. On the way to the party, my mother told me that it would be nice if I sang a few songs. I kind of expected that but pretended to grudgingly agree. Just as we pulled into the parking lot, she floored me with her next announcement. "Oh, Robbie," my mother said as the car came to a stop, "I just want to let you know that I invited Susie and George Menard." "What?" I almost choked. "Why the hell did you invite my ex-wife and her turd of a husband?" My mother just smirked and said, "Spite." When I saw the crowd, I relaxed because I figured that I'd never see them amid the hundreds of people there. Besides, there were many of my relatives hovering around me and a ton of my friends. Still, my hope that I wouldn't run into my ex-wife wasn't to be. About a half hour after I got there, I turned around and came face to face with Susie and George. Susie looked like she had put on at least 20 pounds. The dress she was wearing made her look like 10 pounds of potatoes stuffed in a 5-pound sack. George looked like he was a 70-year-old man, and I knew he was only in his 50s. "Robbie," Susie's eyes lit up, "how are you doing?" The devil on my shoulder was feeding dozens of nasty things to say, while the angel was telling me to play nice. The angel won out, mostly because I figured my mother would be annoyed with me if I let my temper loose. "I'm doing great, thank you," I said through a fake smile. "How are you guys doing?" "We're doing great also," Susie continued to beam. "George now has 4 car dealerships. He's even more successful than when I married him." "That's nice," I said, wanting desperately to be away from these two. When nothing obvious presented itself and Susie continued to tell me how great she was doing, the devil on my shoulder started to speak up. "Well, George," I said with a wide smile, "if you hadn't stolen my wife, I never would have moved out of Tifton. I never would have found this great career I have now. Instead, I'd be sitting in our old house watching Susie get fat. You guys have a good time with that." I turned and headed to the other side of the hall. I glanced at my mother to see if she had heard any of the exchange, and she had. As I moved past my mom, I saw that she was trying to hide her amusement behind her hands. A quick glance back showed Susie beet red, giving her husband an earful. The party was actually very enjoyable. I learned that all of my mother's sisters and their friends had put the festivities together, and when the final count was made, 414 people showed up. I know this because I paid for most of the party. There was no way I was going to let my parents pay for a party this big. The day before I was scheduled to return to Atlanta, I got a frantic call from Tanya. Alex had had a heart attack. That was the beginning of the end for Tanya and me. I made it back to Atlanta in record time and thankfully found that Alex would recover fully. However, he was very troubled and expressed his problem the first day he was back at his office. To him, the heart attack had been a wake-up call. Alex thought it best if he retired. He would stay on until we found someone else and then allow us to cancel the remainder of his contract with us. That was exceedingly generous considering that the contract had 3 years remaining on it, and he really didn't have to do anything during that time except collect his 10%. But that was the kind of guy Alex was. Tanya and Alex did all of the original interviewing of potential new managers. When it came down to 2 candidates, I was brought in for the final interviews. Todd Wilton was a good-looking guy in his early 40s. He had managed several well-known groups successfully. Sonia Hilliker, on the other hand, was a 33-year-old blonde with an impressive resume but had only managed smaller groups. However, each group she guided managed to come from nothing to some significance. Todd had only managed to hold his groups at the same level. I was fine with either candidate, but I thought Sonia was probably the better of the two because she had managed to increase the popularity of her groups. In contrast, while Todd managed his groups well, he hadn't been able to grow them much at all. I wasn't surprised that Tanya favored Todd. I could tell very quickly that my wife didn't care for Sonia at all. I should have fought for my choice, but at the time it didn't seem wise to bring in a manager who would be butting heads with Tanya right off the bat. Besides, I was fine with either. In the end, Todd was hired. I didn't realize it at the time, but Todd turned out to be a complete jerk. For the first 6 months, I didn't notice anything different. Then I began to get a feeling that something was off. Tanya started spending more time with Todd, supposedly going over finances or schedules. Then Todd began scheduling personal appearances for Tanya and me separately. He explained that by splitting us up, we could cover more ground. It seemed reasonable, even though I wasn't happy with it. My world turned upside down after the last concert of the most recent tour, and I was completely blindsided by what happened. I felt particularly good that the tour was over, and Tanya and I could spend some alone time together. We had been the opening act for a group called the Down Home Boys. They had gone on tour after scoring their 3rd #1 hit. We had opened for 8 of their 10 shows, and they seemed very happy with us. I had just finished writing 2 new songs that I thought were pretty good and was eager to get back to Atlanta to record them. I wasn't going to tell Tanya about the songs because I wanted to surprise her, with her birthday only a couple of weeks away. However, after a passionate night of lovemaking, I told her about the songs anyway. Tanya became excited and wanted to see the songs right away, so I dug them out. Then we played them a couple of times, naked in bed. Tanya was thrilled with both. By this time in our careers, Tanya and I had perhaps moved to the middle of the B group. I was hoping that my 2 new songs would move us up a little further. I knew that Tanya was becoming less enchanted as an opening act. She wanted to be the sole attraction. However, I knew that the chances of that happening were slim, but I thought my 2 new songs would push us a little closer to that possibility. Lord knows that Todd hadn't come up with anything new to help us. In fact, I had checked the schedule for next year, and it was pretty sparse. I remember at the time wondering why Tanya thought Todd was doing such a great job. Of course, I was a trusting fool, and it would come back to bite me in the ass. It was a Monday morning, and we were catching a 10 a.m. flight out of LaGuardia Airport back to Atlanta. Tanya's bags had already been taken down to the lobby, and I was just waiting for someone to come get mine. Tanya told me she wanted to pick up something at one of the stores and would meet me at the airport. I told her we were cutting it kind of close and not to dawdle. I was sitting on the bed waiting when a gentleman in a light gray suit appeared at the door. "Mr. Robbie Wilder?" he asked. I nodded, and he handed me an envelope, saying, "You've been served." I was totally confused and asked, "What are you talking about?" But the man was already gone. I had a sinking feeling as I looked at the envelope in my hand, and when I opened it, my world imploded. Tanya had filed for divorce against me. I sat on the bed, stunned for quite some time, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, I was roused from my trance by the bellboy as the young man was collecting my bags. I started to read through the papers. Tanya was divorcing me, citing mental cruelty and physical abuse. That charge was a lie, and the red-hot anger that filled me actually overpowered my feelings of despair. I had never raised my hand or my voice to Tanya. Why would she make such an outrageous accusation right now? My only thought was to confront her and ask her why. As I read further, I was stunned to find out that she demanded most of our assets. I kept telling myself that this had to be a terrible mistake. I had to talk to Tanya and get this straightened out. but my call to her cell phone sent ice-cold fear to my heart. Her cell phone was no longer in service. Then it hit me, and everything clicked into place. Todd. All the late nights, the coolness, the snide comments, or the smirks by Todd when he thought I didn't see. Right then, the red-hot anger turned to white-hot rage. But then, as quickly as that feeling came, I was lost again in a sea of despair. I dropped the divorce papers on the floor and was about to drop the envelope when I realized there was more inside it. Shaking out the other piece of paper, I discovered another legal document, a restraining order. It stated that I was to stay 500 feet away from Tanya and 500 feet away from our home and studio if Tanya was there. My heart was utterly broken. I couldn't understand any of this. Tanya and I had made love the night before, and it had been passionate. Surely, she didn't fall out of love with me in one day. It suddenly hit me like a thunderbolt. Maybe she never loved me at all. My head was spinning, and my stomach was churning, ready to revolt. At that moment, I don't think I was having anything close to rational thought. When the nauseous feeling overwhelmed me, I bolted to the bathroom. When my stomach was finally empty and somewhat calmed, I wandered to the window, looking down at all the people hurrying around below. I envied every one of those thousands of people because they weren't me. If I could have gotten the window open, I might have even considered jumping. I felt like my whole reason for living was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, but suddenly I needed something to drink. My attention instantly went to the minibar, and I helped myself to one of those mini bottles of scotch. My mind went into a sort of haze by the third bottle, and the pain wasn't as acute. Despite my brain being clouded, the alcohol did calm me and allowed me to begin reviewing my current situation. Yet, every which way I looked, I was totally and completely screwed. I needed to do something, but for the life of me, I had no idea what. The only thing that kept flooding my mind was that I wanted to totally destroy Tanya and Todd. But then I flashed back to Susie leaving me and how impotent I had been then. It looked like once again I wouldn't be able to do anything to my betrayers. I grabbed another bottle of scotch and gathered up the papers. I almost tore them to shreds, but instead, I read further, and it just got worse. All of our joint assets had been frozen pending the court deciding a final division. Then I found the final insult, which sent fury racing back through my alcohol-muddled brain. My first-class ticket back to Atlanta had been canceled and replaced with an economy ticket for 2 days later. This was all so cold and hateful. At that moment, pure white hatred of Tanya and Todd filled my being. I wanted them destroyed. I swore to myself that I would have some measure of revenge for the total disrespect and contempt with which they had treated me, even if it took the rest of my life. But at the moment, I couldn't think of one thing that I could do to hit back at them. I just couldn't get my head around the fact that Tanya had not only betrayed our marriage but also our business partnership. That wasn't bad enough. Tanya and Todd were trying to totally destroy my music career. If they could make those abuse accusations stick, I was in deep trouble. This was especially true given the current climate where the mantra was that the woman had to be believed, regardless of evidence. A cold chill ran through me as I suddenly realized how dire my situation was. It became apparent that if I didn't act soon, they would steamroll me, and I'd be nothing more than a grease spot on the pavement. My first decision was to go online and examine our checking accounts, personal and business. As the court papers indicated, the accounts were flagged. I had no idea how much should be in the business account, but I knew it should be considerably more than it was. As for our personal account, I knew it was seriously depleted. I had taken money out of an ATM the previous evening and still had the receipt, which showed the balance was almost 3 times what was displayed today. After 2 failed attempts to operate the phone due to my alcohol-impaired brain, I finally reached the front desk. I told them to hold Tanya's luggage for a bit. I would be down shortly to make arrangements for it. For my luggage, I asked them to bring it back up because I'd be staying an additional 2 nights. I then sat back down and started going through the paperwork in detail. I dumped the remaining scotch in the little bottle down the sink. My anger was now overriding my self-pity. Over the following weeks, those 2 emotions would take turns dominating, but at the moment, I was beyond furious. If I wanted to defend myself, I needed a clearer head to plan my next steps. I read through everything twice and was still outraged. I put the papers aside and decided to take care of Tanya's luggage first. I arranged to have it put into an off-site self-storage unit, paying with a personal credit card that I don't think Tanya knew I had. It was a petty thing, but I had no intention of telling Tanya where her stuff was. Then I called our attorney, Greg Pinder. That was another shock. Greg told me he had been retained by Tanya and could do nothing for me. I was furious and lashed out. "Of course, you know that this means I will never use you again and we are no longer friends," I said testily. "Robbie, I'm going to let that remark pass because I know you're extremely upset at the moment," Greg said. "You think I'm upset?" I asked with cold fury. "You have no idea. You were my parents' attorney before you became mine. I was the one who brought you on as our business attorney, and when you decided you wanted to become an entertainment attorney, I referred clients to you. You knew all this was going on, and you let Tanya stab me in the back without a word. You should have stayed out of this and referred Tanya to a different attorney. Instead, you chose sides, and that was a bad decision on your part. I will no longer refer anyone to you and, in fact, I'll advise anyone who asks that you can't be trusted." "Are you threatening me?" Greg said with some anger. "No, I'm telling you to screw off, you piece of shit." I slammed the phone down. I didn't know if I could hurt Greg's practice, but I was sure going to try. I knew he had about a dozen show business clients, and I'd sent 7 of them to him. I also believed that a word to 3 or 4 of them would have them looking for a new attorney. As I raged about Greg's betrayal, it struck me that he probably wasn't the only one who knew what was going on. Thinking back to the people in the studio, they might not have known what Tanya and Todd were up to, but they had to know Tanya was cheating on me. Greg and all those other pigs were the least of my problems. This day was just getting worse and worse, and I had to try to stop the bleeding with my whole world turned to shit. I hit the minibar, but instead of alcohol, I grabbed a soft drink. I needed my wits about me so I could plan my revenge. Then a small thought struck me: the company would still be responsible for the room until checkout time. If I couldn't access any money from the company, I'd force the company to pay for my snacks and drinks. So I called the front desk and instructed them to double stock the minibar. I was in so much emotional pain, and no matter how I tried to understand, I couldn't get my mind around it. If Tanya wanted to be with Todd, all she had to do was tell me she wanted a divorce. I would have been crushed, but not like this. This was more than just a divorce. There was something else going on, but I didn't know what it was. At that moment, however, there was no doubt in my mind that this was all Todd's idea. I really wanted to believe that Tanya didn't fully know what was happening, but that didn't make sense. I had to face the reality that none of this could have started without Tanya's willingness to go along. I just lay there for the next 2 hours, feeling sorry for myself. I did a fair amount of crying. Why was it that women felt like they had to treat me like shit? I had taken it all my life, and I had never really been able to get back at any female who had turned on me. Now Tanya was not only leaving me but planning to ruin my career, and from the wreckage, she intended to make herself bigger and better than before. Hatred and anger filled me until I finally exploded, yelling, "I'm not taking this anymore." I tried to reason through it all. Tanya and Todd had waited until the end of the tour, probably to avoid any breach of contract issues, but I didn't understand why they had tried to trap me in New York. Maybe they were going to try to scoop up all the assets before I got back to Atlanta, but what good would that do in the divorce? The company books would be examined, and everything would be split 50-50ths. Maybe Tanya wanted to claim occupancy of the house. I didn't care about that. She could have it. Maybe they were trying to make me feel financially desperate so they could approach me with some kind of ridiculous settlement. They had to realize that regardless of what they offered, I wouldn't accept it, even if I had to sleep on the street. None of this made any sense. However, the more I thought about their attempts to squeeze me into a financial box, the more I had to admit it seemed plausible. But if that was their plan, they had badly miscalculated. I was pretty sure they had no knowledge of my personal accounts because our partnership was actually a limited liability corporation. Our tax accountant had insisted that we each take a salary to ensure that the IRS would leave us alone. We each received a salary of $6,000 a month. After everything was taken out, I had been putting almost $4,500 a month into a brokerage account. Tanya and I both made personal appearances and got paid directly for them. Tanya spent most of her money on clothes, jewelry, and artwork. I, instead, Invested all that money with my broker. It was just the way I was raised. My personal account now had almost $800,000. I had an ATM card and could call to have money sent to me directly. Even though the royalties for my songs had slacked off in recent years, they were still bringing in $15,000 to $20,000 a year, and the royalties from these songs were mine. Todd had tried to talk me into putting the songs into the corporation, but I had flatly refused. In the back of my mind, I planned to sign over these songs to Tanya for our 10th anniversary. That was not going to happen now. Even though I had booked the room for an additional 2 days, I toyed with the idea of catching a flight that evening back to Atlanta. I decided against it because there was nothing back there for me. Instead, I decided to call our old agent, Alex, and discuss the mess Tanya and Todd had created for me. "Hello," I heard Alex's familiar voice. "Alex, it's me, Robbie," I tried to sound upbeat. "Robbie, great to hear from you. How are you and Tanya doing?" "Terrible," I responded. "That's why I'm calling. Tanya has filed for divorce, citing mental and physical abuse as the reason. She and Todd have also slapped a restraining order and an injunction on me. They're trying to cut me off from any company assets and cutting off any discussion between Tanya and me. They've also retained Greg Pender, so right now I'm up the creek without a paddle. If Greg has truly agreed to represent Tanya, then he has a serious conflict of interest," Alex said forcefully. "But that's something we can address later. I have plans for Greg in the future, Robbie." "I agree he's a minor irritation right now," Alex continued. "But I'm sorry, Robbie. I should have said something when you and Tanya decided to get married. I knew you were crazy about her, but I also knew she didn't feel the same way about you. Tanya told me she was very fond of you but wasn't interested in getting married. Then I made the mistake of casually mentioning that a wedding could generate huge publicity. Tanya immediately flipped for the idea. I realized right then that while she cared for you, Tanya cared way more for her career. She's the worst kind of publicity seeker. I believe she'd sell her soul to become a superstar." Hearing what Alex had to say cut deeper into me. As I looked back over my relationship with Tanya, I realized I had been way more in love with her than she ever was with me. In fact, now I questioned whether everything about my marriage was a lie. "Robbie, I know you're in a bad place right now," Alex said soothingly. "But I'll help you any way I can. From what you're telling me, your marriage is dead. So what do you want to do now?" The pain that had been growing was overwhelming me. I was surprised by the words that flowed out of my mouth. "I want to burn the whole thing down. She destroyed what was most important to me. I want to destroy what's most important to her." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Alex sighed. "I'm not sure what that means, but I strongly suggest you just walk away from her. Let the lawyers handle the divorce and the dissolution of the business. You're talented enough to start a career on your own. Don't let this turn you bitter." "Too late to stop that, Alex," I admitted because I was beyond bitter and desperately wanted to hurt Tanya. I knew Tanya's greatest desire was to become a superstar, but I didn't have a clue how to prevent her from achieving that. Chances were she wouldn't make it, regardless of what Todd had planned, but that wasn't enough for me. I needed to mess with her rise to fame. That was the way to hit back. And if Tanya failed, seeing her turn on Todd would be satisfying. "Okay," Alex said with a sigh. "I'm not sure exactly what you want to do about getting back at Tanya, but for now, let's start with the basics. I'm going to give you the number of an attorney to handle your divorce. He's a real shark. I'll also give you the number of a corporate attorney to fight for your business rights. If you don't have the money, I'll front you the retainers." "No, that's all right. I've got enough of my own money," I said. "Hang on a second," Alex said suddenly. "There's something about Tanya on the news." I waited on the phone for what felt like an eternity before Alex returned. "Todd just announced your divorce, citing physical and mental abuse. He also mentioned that Tanya is launching a solo career. They're going to cut a new album with new songs and are planning a new tour for Tanya. They didn't waste any time, did they?" I said, despair filling my voice. A horrible feeling gripped me, and I blurted out, "My songs." I dropped the phone and began frantically searching through my luggage for the shoe boxes with my songs in them. When I finally found them, my relief was short-lived. The boxes were empty. Tanya had stolen my songs. "Alex, are you still there?" I asked with a hint of panic in my voice. "Yeah," he answered, confused. "What's going on?" "Tanya stole my songs," I said, my voice cracking with despair. "Now it all makes sense," Alex responded. "Todd isn't a pig, but he's smart. They stranded you in New York to hustle back to Atlanta and record their new album. They're trying to control the narrative and make you out to be an abuser. I can get some PR people to help you with that. Just remember to push your side of the story every time you talk to the media. Deny the abuse charges and let everyone know how they're trying to steal your portion of the company. I know everything looks dark right now, Robbie, but don't get discouraged. I'll make sure you can fight back." After I hung up from Alex, I felt more like myself again, not the helpless victim Tanya was trying to make me into. I gathered all the paperwork, sorted it out, and prepared to speak intelligently to the two attorneys. By the time I called them, Alex had already informed them to expect my call. I faxed the legal papers and arranged for the retainers to be deposited into their accounts. Now, with nothing to do and stuck in New York for 2 full days and part of a third, I was feeling the walls closing in. I hated New York City, its dirty, smelly streets and rude, arrogant people. Why anyone would want to live there was beyond me. With nothing to occupy my mind, I knew I'd obsess about Tanya and hit the minibar again, so I decided to get out for a while. I took a walk, figuring I could catch a show or do something to distract myself. The walk turned out to be pleasant. It was a nice spring day, and the heavy rains from the night before had cleared the air and somewhat cleaned the city. The temperature was in the mid-60s, and despite the New Yorkers, I was actually enjoying myself. I hit an ATM first and withdrew another $600. New York is super expensive, and I knew the money wouldn't last long. The story continues in the next video. Link to part 2 in the description of this video. Thank you for watching and for your like.